Okay, welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. I am here with John Stewart, a core member of the Evolution, Complexity, and Cognition Research Group at the Free University of Brussels in Belgium. His work currently on the directionality of evolution, implications for humanity. He's on John Vervaeke's podcast. I'd heard of him before. I heard him on that podcast, and you know me, I'm circling around John Vervaeke, and he and I have a lot of shared vision. So hearing John talk on that made me, hey, we got to get him over to UTOKing with Gregg. Made the connection. John, welcome so much. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Gregg. I'm a member of the research group at the Free University of Brussels, Francis Halligan's research group. He's a renowned systems and cybernetician person. But I'm based in Melbourne, so that's where I'm an external member.
Okay.
Mainly meet in virtual space. So it's really good to meet you, Gregg, because I've watched a number of your videos over the years, and I've always found them stimulating and interesting. So it'll actually be good to talk. We'll have some interesting things to talk about.
I think so.
Will I begin by sort of outlining?
Please. Yeah, we ask folks, I am a clinician, so I like to hear people's stories and background and what it is that makes them alive. And I know that evolution and its conscious awareness of it to orient us is going to be a central theme. But yeah, please share us a little bit of background.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, basically as a teenager, I read Teilhard de Chardin's books, and they inspired me. And I thought, well, he's got it pretty well sorted out. He's identified, the trajectory of evolution, which is basically a, successive integration from elementary particles, successively integrating step by step, to eventually you get to, life, cells, integration of cells into cooperatives of cells, integration of cooperatives of cells, and you get multicellular organisms. And then that repeats itself, and with humanity, it repeats itself. We started off as kin groups, tribes and amalgamations of tribes and so on. And now we're, this whole trajectory that began with, life about 1/1000th of a metre across in diameter. Now we have cooperatives, integrations that cover continents.
Right.
And it's easy to see what the next step is. In any event, so Teilhard de Chardin, he basically sketched that out in in broad terms, and then he ended up, because he made his living as a Catholic priest, a Jesuit priest. So he had to sort of bind religion in there somewhere, and that's how I saw it as a teenager. I sort of thought, well, he sort of if you cut off the end chapters of his books, the Christian part where he tries to basically say, well, to please the elders of the church, all this ends up in what we believe in already, which is Jesus Christ, the body of Christ, and so on. So I didn't buy that bit, but I bought the evolutionary stuff. So that really inspired me. Another major influence was, strangely, because it's a far, far narrower application of the evolutionary understanding, is Desmond Morris's The Naked Ape.
Okay.
So, and what I found about that was that it was extremely powerful. The evolutionary perspective could explain things that you couldn't explain in any other way. So in particular, as a teenage boy, I was intrigued to see that the evolutionary perspective and evolutionary dynamics could explain why females have breasts that from a distance can look like buttocks. So basically, he, as I said, it was at the far more micro level than Teilhard de Chardin, and certainly far from the Christianity that Teilhard de Chardin ended up with, but it showed the power of the evolutionary worldview. And I thought, well, that's evolution. You need evolution to explain everything. You can explain why we are what we are, and you extend the Desmond Morris approach, and you can explain why we have ethics, why we have morality, why our morality takes the shape that it does, why the ethical principles that human beings identify with, even though they can't find a philosophical foundation for them, as many philosophers have demonstrated, the evolutionary perspective, an understanding of evolutionary dynamics can show why we have the particular, ethical principles that we do, and why we'll die for them, and so on. So that was very powerful for me.
Okay.
And in fact, as a mid-teens, when I was sort of 16 or 17, I earned my living through writing fishing articles for national fishing magazines, because I was a fishing fanatic.
Okay.
And my final article, because I found, more efficient ways to make money than writing fishing articles. My final article was basically, broadly, this is in a popular national fishing magazine, was an evolutionary analysis of fish behaviour, and then using that to understand how to catch more fish. So that's the power of that's the power of the evolutionary worldview. You can apply it to fishing, and I did as a 17-year-old.
Wow.
In any event, so I go off to university. Did biology mainly because I wanted to be a marine biologist, because I thought, well, I was obsessed with fishing, and I thought, well, as a marine biologist, I'll be able to go fishing all the time. So it was a means to an end. But I increasingly got captured by the evolutionary worldview and intellectuality in general. So I took off from university after 2 years and earned enough money to buy my own fishing boat, and I fished on the Great Barrier Reef out of Cairns and so on, 50 miles out to sea, catching mackerel and reef fish. Wow. It's one of the few fisheries in the world where you can make a living catching fish the same way amateurs do, that is by line. You catch these mackerel one by one. Wow. So in any event, however, the intellectuality continually proceeded to capture me, and I changed from wanting to spend my life cruising the Pacific in my boat, catching fish, to wanting to be an intellectual. I mean, this arose because when the wind blew and you couldn't go out in the reef fishing, which it often did, the trade wind blew, I'd go to the Cairns Library. Magnificent, old Queenslander building, multi-staired and so on, a wooden building. And I thought, well, I'll start, being a bit autistic, I thought, well, I'll start in the Dewey system from 0001 or whatever how it starts. And they happen to be philosophy. Philosophy, if you start from the beginning.
Is that where it starts? I didn't know that. That's interesting.
And so I read Bertrand.
Seems appropriate.
It should be the beginning, the foundations of all and everything, if philosophy is very good. And a lot of it has, it's shown, a lot of philosophy, particularly analytic philosophy, has argued that we can't create foundations for anything. Rather, instead of producing those foundations. So anyway, I started reading the books, read Bertrand Russell, and I got more interested in philosophy, and that. So I went back to university, still and did all the subjects on evolution I could, and still didn't ever meet Teilhard de Chardin. I mean, Teilhard de Chardin, is on the nose. Well, he's ignored by current evolutionary theory and so on. And then I finished my degree, and I thought, well, I thought I'd be an academic and go on and so on. But I surveyed the evolutionary field, the field of evolutionary science, and came to the conclusion that it's anti-big picture thinking. So evolutionary science, it's not as narrow as behaviorism, in psychology, in your field. But behaviorism is, extraordinarily narrow, and I see it as one of the great crimes of the 20th century, behaviorism, psychology.
I'd love to dialogue with you about that. I'll probably be in strong agreement with
right. Well, yeah, the reason why it's one of the great crimes of the 20th century is because it directed the attention and efforts and resource of hundreds of thousands of highly intelligent, highly qualified people who wanted to study psychology, and it directed their attention to these narrow understandings of stimulus and response. It wouldn't postulate the existence of minds. It wouldn't. It was on the nose. It was unacceptable to postulate cognition and so on, and that cognition only came into psychology in any big way, in the second half of the 20th century. So it was an enormous waste of talent that could have been used far more usefully to understand, human psychology. And one of the manifestations of this is that, and I was one of these students, that the world is full of intelligent young people who are full of energy and excitement about doing psychology, and they do psychology 101 because they want to get some understanding about how their mind works, how their psychology works, and how the psychology of their friends work and everything else. And they do psychology 101, and it's rats and stats. It's they learn very little about mind and how mind works and so on.
I'm very happy to talk about this topic.
Well, I left that far behind, as I'll eventually get to slowly and so on. But so anyway, I surveyed the evolutionary field and discovered that basically it had been infested by the same philosophical underpinnings as behaviorism, which is basically logical positivism, which is that you can only deal with those things you can measure directly, which basically, to me, that's concrete operations thinking. It's not even formal operations, let alone post-formal thinking. Right. So it's concrete operations thinking. So the big picture evolutionary thinking of Teilhard de Chardin requires abstraction upon abstraction upon abstraction. You're dealing with things you can't see and touch. You're dealing with evolutionary history and evolutionary dynamics at a much larger scale and so on. Right. So the only time the evolutionary scientists in the second half of the 20th century started to deal with the big picture issues, and in particular applied evolutionary theory to humans. The only time they'd do that is in their final book, often a post-retirement book, and it'd be the final chapter of that book. So they'd finally get to what interested me, what excited me, what drove me, when they got to the end, and it was safe to do so, basically. So I thought, well, I'm not so. And I looked at the PhD students around me, and I thought, well, they spend their life as logical positivists do, counting and measuring. And I didn't want to count and measure, animals and things. I wanted to be an intellectual. I'd made that transition. I wanted stimulating ideas. I wanted to be challenged intellectually and so on. So I saw there was no place for me in academic evolutionary science. And I didn't want to count and measure for 50 years to earn the right to write the final chapter in my book. So I left academia, but I always had in my mind that I wanted to pursue this intuition, that really a comprehensive theory of evolution should cover everything, because evolution is basically change. And a comprehensive evolutionary theory, should cover all the sciences, and in particular all the human sciences, because we're products of evolution, we're shaped by evolution and so on. So in any event, I became a union official and a arbitration advocate in court proceedings and did all these things, and eventually I ended up as the manager of Australia's northeastern fisheries. So I actually got a bit into that, and managed some of the fisheries that I'd actually fished in earlier as a teenager. professional fisherman. And then I moved into government policy advice and so on, and policies about how Australia should set up its industrial relations system to govern, how wages should be increased and so on. So, but all the time, I was really interested. This was a means to an end. I had to earn an income, and I had a family and 2 wonderful little girls, and I had to provide for them. But my fundamental interest was in, the evolutionary big picture.
Right.
So I read and thought and so on. And eventually I started writing papers. So I've written and got invited to join the research group at the Free University of Brussels.
Right.
So I've published over a dozen papers in international peer-reviewed science journals about the trajectory of evolution and its implications for humanity. And I've published a book called Evolution's Arrow, the direction of evolution and the future of humanity. So that's basically my story. And now I'm retired, and so I'm a full-time evolutionary activist and evolutionary theorist. Haven't done paid work for 15 years now. I'm free. So the issue, the key issue is where, that's the backstory. The key issue is, where it's led me. So, and basically, I discovered that a properly developed evolutionary worldview answers the big existential questions that face all of us individually and collectively. And those big existential questions are, where do we come from? What are we? More importantly, where are we going to? And most importantly of all, what should we do with our lives, on a day-to-day basis? So the evolutionary worldview that I've helped develop answers those big existential questions. Hopefully, that piques some interest. Well, how the hell does it do that?
Hey, we got existential answers here. Or we got to be excited about that.
That's right. So how does it do that? Well, what evolution science is beginning to understand is that there's a trajectory to evolution. So evolution's going somewhere. There is this much larger evolutionary game in which we're embedded, even though very, very few human beings understand the nature of this game. And it's a game that you have to play if you want to survive and thrive. It's a game humanity has to play if you want to survive and thrive. More importantly, and this is the point I'll come back to and emphasise and justify and underline, because it's the most critical point of all. When you understand the trajectory of evolution, you see that it gets up to a certain point automatically through natural selection and unconscious processes. But then beyond that point, to proceed further, it has to happen intentionally. It has to happen consciously, and the vehicle for that intentional driving of the evolutionary process forward is humanity. So there's a role for humanity. In effect, this unconscious process is now internalized into human psyche and human culture. And the evolutionary process, which was natural selection, which used to explore possibility space, in biological terms, now explores, it's now human intelligence and human culture that explores possibility space for our current evolution. And it has to, if it doesn't happen intentionally, it doesn't proceed, the process fails. It has to happen intentionally, and it has to happen intentionally through us. Hence, there's a role for human beings. So, coming back to this trajectory, what you do when you identify a trajectory in evolution is you identify what succeeds. You identify what survives and thrives. And in so doing, you also identify what is selected out of existence. So if there is a trajectory to evolution, it defines, if you're conscious and guiding your own evolution, it defines what you have to do in order to survive and thrive. You examine the trajectory, you locate yourself on it, and you see what you have to do to survive and thrive into the future.
Okay.
Not be selected out. So this trajectory, is broadly, there's two great arcs in this trajectory, two great themes.
Good. I was just about to ask you about that. This core ingredients, these two elements of complexification and evolvability. Yeah, let's get into those. That'd be great.
Yeah. So one is the trend towards increasing integration and cooperation, which basically Teilhard, Desjardins identified. But I'll just, so broad. So that's the successive integration. It's this stepwise process in which, life when it first emerged was a cooperative of molecular processes, an autocatalytic set of proteins that came to be governed by RNA to form the first protocell. So, and that was, as I mentioned, a millionth of a metre across. So that's the extent of cooperation at that time. And these different cooperatives competed with one another, often destructively, and so on. That's the dynamic. Cooperation does not emerge easily. Competition undermines cooperation, and so on, until you have an arrangement that emerges that quells the competition and enables cooperation to flourish.
Exactly.
And so that happened to form the first protocells from these molecular processes, and they competed destructively until a mechanism arose that enabled them to cooperate. And once cooperation arises, it outcompetes everything else hands down. So it's just like a team of cooperative human individuals will always outcompete an isolated individual.
Right.
A tribe will wipe out isolated kin groups. Amalgamations of tribes will wipe out tribes, and eventually nation states will wipe out tribes, as we're brilliantly doing and have done in the world today. So cooperation succeeds. The first simple cells form communities of simple cells, which is the eukaryote complex cell, which a number of its organelles originated from bacteria that were engulfed in the simple cells and so on. So our cells, if we look down into our body, our cells are actually cooperatives of simpler cells that are cooperatives of molecular processes. And then those complex cells got together through a mechanism, again, that governed the destructive competition, quelled it, enabled cooperation to arise. And you have, this glorious thing that each of us are, a galaxy, of 3 to 10 trillion cells cooperating together. And none of those cells know us. They don't know who we are. They don't care about our goals. They're totally ignorant of those. They just do their cellular things. But in so pursuing their own cellular interests, because of the way they're organised, they produce our speech, our cognition, our walking, this amazing orchestration of these trillions of cells. So then you get those cooperatives of multicellular organisms such as ourselves, and particularly in humans. I mentioned kin groups, tribes, and so on. At each step along the way, you had, tribes destructively competing with one another until a mechanism arose that quelled the destructive competition and enabled cooperation to flourish. And once cooperation flourished, that outcompeted those that weren't cooperating, and so on.
Gotcha.
And now we're at the level of nation states.
So it's like we need some superordinate governance system that would afford us cooperation in an effective way, if only.
That's right. That's simply what it is. So this insight came to me when I remember the moment in my house in Canberra, Australia, where, and the insight that came, which is just reflected in what you said, is that a cell is that the DNA of the cell is the governor of the cell, in the same way that to a global system, an integrated cooperative global system, which is like a cell on a enormously greater scale, it needs global governance. So the DNA is to the cell what global governance is to the globe. And that function of that governance is to make cooperation possible. And without it, you don't get cooperation, you get destructive competition. So we have nation states in the world today. We don't have a system of governance above them.
Right.
They therefore just compete destructively, as manifesting in, well, the great history of the United States of America. One of the great, most destructive competitors that the world's ever seen. Look what you did in Vietnam and Iraq and so on, and Putin's now copying you in the Ukraine. But America wants to monopolize that and so on, and so it doesn't want that. So you have this destructive competition, and we've been on the brink of nuclear war, and that would be a manifestation of this destructive competition.
Of course.
And it can wipe out the whole
stack,
the whole project of evolution on this planet can be, and certainly wipe us out. So equally, it's driving environmental destruction, this destructive competition involving now multinational corporations. Some of them are bigger than some governments, so they're involved in this destructive competition, and they're manipulating the whole system so that they can succeed in this destructive competition and make more money. Oil companies are doing that, even though a side effect of what they're doing is the likely destruction of human civilization this century and so on. So this is the same dynamic that existed, with molecular processes, existed with simple cells and complex cells and so on, and it needs the same solution. And it's obvious where it needs to go. So where it needs to go is the superordinate system of governance that constrains nation states. And just as within a nation state, you need a system of governance that punishes people who undermine cooperation by robbing banks, by taking what's not theirs, and so on. You need that at the international level, and it's so to punish free riders and destructive competitors, and so on, and to align the interests. So what it did at every other level, the system of governance is align the interests of the component processes with the interests of the whole.
Right.
And that alignment doesn't, and this is part of the good news for future human evolution, this alignment doesn't require us all to become saints.
Right.
That saint-like Mother Teresa's, that choose to cooperate despite it being in our interests in some circumstances, not to cooperate. It doesn't happen in that way. It happens through through alignment of interests.
Right.
So at the end of the day, if you have alignment of interests, you still all the subordinate entities feel free to pursue their own interests, which they are, like the cells within our body. They pursue their own interests like the cells in our body because of the form of organisation that results in, in our body, in differentiation, diversity. There's no central imposed way of behaving on all our cells.
Right.
In fact, and this is a fascinating thing about this process of successive integration, that once you solve the cooperation problem through a system of effective governance, then you get this explosion of diversity. It doesn't create uniformity, which is the bogeyman of global governance, which is promoted by those who oppose global governance because it's not in their current interest to. It doesn't happen through suppression. So you get this explosion of diversity. So we have, cells in our body are far, far more diverse than free living cells are, because division of labour and specialisation that's how cooperation manifests in a way that makes us far more effective. So global governance will cause an explosion of diversity and so on. And to the extent that we have, global cooperation already, which happens in some domains, such as to an extent in economic systems, there already is this specialisation, division of labour and so on between countries and so on, enabled by cooperation. So the evolutionary trajectory, once you understand the causal micro foundations of this trajectory, then you can predict where it needs to go and identify what is needed to get it there. So that's the power of this evolutionary worldview. It says if humanity is going to survive and thrive and in effect complete the project of the evolution of life on Earth, then this is what we have to do. Now, I promise to come back to the issue of the fact that there's a role for us as individuals and collectively that's identified by this process. So this process I've described of the increasing integration of the emergence of cooperative organisations of increasing scale. This process was, up until now, was driven by processes that are unconscious and unintentional. And that the process basically involves competition and natural selection and so on. So natural selection, when cooperation is achieved, it outcompetes the competition at lower levels, outcompetes the less cooperative forms, and it emerges, and all that is driven unintentionally. There doesn't have to be any organism that sees that and applies it. However,
variation, selection, retention gives rise to that system. Yes.
Now that mechanism fails when you get to the state we're at now, where the competing entities, there's only less than 200 destructively competing entities on the planet, when for natural selection to operate effectively, you need populations of millions and so on. So there are less than 200 nation states in the world today, and many of them are so small you're not really part of the competition. Additionally, once you do get unification at the global level on a planet, you only have one entity, this global entity. And if it's done successfully, it'll be a cooperative global entity. So there's no population, and this is the critical point, there's no population of global entities competing with one another that are driving selection, driving the further evolution and development of that global entity. So it's possible, that accidentally we could stumble upon the emergence of a global entity. Doesn't look like it at the moment, for it to happen unconsciously, but it could happen. But that global entity won't evolve and develop, because there's no natural selection operating on the level of global entity. There are other global entities elsewhere, almost certainly, but they're not in destructive competition with us. The potential exists, but when you get to this level, you anticipate the future rather than actually operate in it. So now this developmental process of the global entity, I'm starting to use the term global entity. So I need to stop here and point out that this process I've described, of life and its evolution on this planet, the successive integration, is a developmental process. So it's like an embryo, and I like to think of a chicken embryo. Starts with two simple cells, and they reproduce, and then structures which are like cooperative
and differentiate, and cooperative systems create a multifaceted
within the embryo. And if you were a single cell in that embryo and you developed a science and an understanding of what the hell was going on around you, if your science got really good, you would have an evolutionary developmental theory, of what was going on, and you'd say, hey, this this culminates in the hatching of a chicken that goes off to do things that are unimaginable to us, but you know, that's life. So we are like those intelligent cells waking up in the midst of this evolutionary process, and we're beginning to see that it is a developmental process, that it is headed somewhere. Where it's headed is the emergence of a global superorganism, a global entity. And that global entity, then that's not the end of evolution. Yeah, that's not the end of the show. That's a small step along the way, because that global entity will need to develop its own adaptability, its own intelligence, its own evolvability, its own capacity to engage in whatever interactions then occur at that higher level with other global entities that emerge elsewhere. So that's the evolutionary destiny. And one of the reasons why these other global entities haven't contacted us already, well, they haven't contacted me either, but the reason why they haven't.
Some people say they're here, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, they wouldn't be here for the same reason that we don't interfere, you know, in a chicken egg, in the developmental process within a chicken egg, or you know, we don't start communicating and interfering with humans in embryo form. You know, they've got to go through a developmental process. They've got to develop the capacities so that you then can communicate with them, you know, on this higher level. So humanity does, you know, the global entity, the global superorganism, doesn't exist on this planet yet. We have this pandemonium, this cacophony, this, you know, from a higher level, this ridiculous process in which, you know, the right hand is fighting the left hand, and the nation states, you know, could well destroy us through nuclear war, you know, in the next decade even. So there's no one to talk to. There's no one for the, you know, other global entities to talk to with. And they also see, because they've been through this process, you know, they see the evolutionary trajectory, they see what's needed to advance it and so on, and they've successfully done that. So they can see, and this is the most critical point of all, they can see that we have to go through these developmental processes and overcome, you know, this destructive competition if we are to become a global entity that eventually will be able to take its place, you know, amongst global entities and that communicate and so on. So any interference, you know, this idea that, you know, why don't they help us get over these problems? The reason why they don't help us is because that wouldn't be help. That would be hindrance. So you can perceive it as this destructive competition which is going on between nation states in the world today is calling into existence the structures and so on that are needed to overcome it, that also enable, you know, this emergence of the cooperative global entity. And any interference would prevent those structures from being called into existence, and those structures, global governance and so on, are essential for us to become a global entity that can function effectively and develop effectively, you know, furtherance. So we won't, if we do make this step and become a global entity, we won't be, you know, interfering with, you know, embryos that are developing on other planets. So now I should move now into, you know, the psychological realm. Because eventually, you know, I am getting there. So, which might interest you more, but you're interested in everything anyway. So,
well, yeah. No, I think I certainly, everything that you say so far, you to me, I would say, or let me check in with you in terms of what you're saying about other global entities. We can imagine the other global entities out there in potential relation we can imagine maybe nobody knows about us. I mean, I guess it depends on how, when you say the other global entities are essentially waiting for us to wake up, or waiting for us to form our global entity that we would then plug into. That sounds plausible to me, but also speculative, quite speculative. Can you tell me a little bit about what kind of ontology you're claiming in relationship to that set of assertions?
Right. Well, first of all, the interesting thing about life on this planet is that if you understand how life first emerged, these first cooperating molecular processes and first protocells, then you see that there's no magic required, there's no miracle required. The more we understand about the origins of life, and really, biology is just starting to grapple with that. There aren't particularly very good theories around, but increasingly it's clear that there's no great barrier. So it'll happen, and there are billions of planets like ours in the universe. So there's no barrier to it happening. More importantly, the whole process I've just described has no particular barriers in it. It's driven, as I said, unconsciously by natural selection, this successive integration and so on. This process of life begins to explore this possibility space, and there are the attractors in possibility space are cooperatives and cooperatives of cooperatives and so on. So that process is driven, it's causally driven. You can identify the causal microfoundations, and they're universal. There are, again, no barriers. So once you get, simple life on a planet broadly like ours, and probably ones that are totally different to ours as well, you will get this process that will lead eventually to where we are. And if the sentient organisms that are on the brink of destroying the planet develop a theory of evolution and understand the trajectory and where they need to go, and start instituting intentional evolution, they'll build the structures needed to underpin this global entity. So that's why. So this is still speculation, but then all great theories are speculative.
Sure. No. Yeah.
And they make predictions, and those predictions need to be tested. And the micro foundations of this theory are highly testable.
Sure. No,
they lead to all sorts of implications. So it predicts, for example, that when cooperative transitions arise, they'll have a certain structure. There'll be a two-tiered structure of governance and a metabolism, broadly speaking. Okay. And so you can that's falsifiable predictions made by the theory, and you can test them, and they pass the test. So that's why I say, an example you can give is, again, United States of America. The American Indians. The American Indians didn't know that they were they didn't know that there are other people, other cultures. They didn't know Britain existed, Europe existed, and that they were very good at destructive competition and developed weapons and so on. So they lived their tribal life and harmony with their environment, and broadly speaking, a good time was had by all. But then out of the blue comes these, the aliens from elsewhere on the planet, and they didn't know there was an elsewhere. Belatedly, they, to try and repel the rapacious invaders, they started to form cooperatives. They started to form federations of tribes and so on.
Sure.
And they had some victories, doing that, but basically it was too late. And the same thing happened in South Africa with the rise of South Africa and so on. The same dynamic applied, where there's a realization that to deal with existential threats, you need to form larger scale cooperatives. So basically, I'm saying that the part of the reason why we need to develop, a global entity, and then develop that global entity and so on, is because we don't want to be like the American Indians,
right,
who were blind to the possibility, which was in fact an actuality, that there was life elsewhere on this planet and it could threaten them, and they needed to develop the capacity to interact with it effectively and deal with it effectively and so on. So I promised to, that was my response to your the issue you raised about, is this just pure wild speculation, or is there, a stronger basis to it? And it's a much stronger basis to it than science fiction because of these causal microfoundations. And I might mention, coming back to Teilhard de Chardin, the key reason why his ideas never got traction in science is because he never established causal microfoundations for this integration process that he described. And it's the same critique justifiably levelled at Karl Marx and his theories of society. And basically Marx and Engels saw themselves as extending the Darwinian understanding to humanity. And Engels at Marx's funeral, said that here we're burying a man who, is the Darwin of the human sciences and so on. But so he developed this brilliant analysis of capitalism and its ills and so on. But then his predictions, and that's the fundamental what transmutes speculative theories into science and differentiates between speculation and science. His predictions weren't based on causal microfoundations and understanding of the causal microfoundations. So they weren't. He was extrapolating patterns, not extrapolating causation, and that's disastrous. So Teilhard de Chardin did the same thing. He didn't establish the causal microfoundations. This big picture understanding of evolution that I'm identifying, a key part of the effort is to identify the causal microfoundations, which it does. It basically, identifies why cooperation succeeds, why it fails up to a certain point until you get the emergence of structures that they're enabling constraints that enable cooperation and so on. And then it enables you then to extrapolate not the pattern, but the causal relations. And you see, yes, they do exist on the level of the planet. If we ignore them, human civilization could well be destroyed this century. And here's what we have to do. Here's the causality that we have to put in place. So in any event, coming back to the psychological side of things, the other great, I mentioned there are two great trajectories in evolution. The other is the trajectory of increasing evolvability. Right. So I'll just try and explain what evolvability is, because again, it's an abstract concept, but it's a very powerful one once it's understood, because it unifies all these apparently different processes that emerge in evolution. It unifies them under a common framework and understanding. So by evolvability, I mean simply this: that imagine any organism at any level in this hierarchy of steps, it needs to adapt to survive. And it actually needs also to innovate to survive, because innovation, if there's innovation and change going on around it, it needs to be able to innovate. So how does it do that? So we're talking basically about what human beings call intelligence. So evolvability is broadly related to intelligence. So another way of conceptualizing it is that there's an organism has a possibility space, which are the changes that can be made to the organism, changing it bit by bit, defines the possibility space that it can move into. And little elements in that possibility space might constitute creative adaptation, new adaptation, successful adaptation. So the task for the organism, to personify it a bit, is to explore possibility space and discover the adaptive bits.
Yep.
which it can also be described as attractors, attractors in possibility space.
Yep.
So how the hell does it discover them? And so the most basic way is natural selection. And you can take a single-celled organism that changes its genes, its genes change one by one mutation. Randomly, it has no understanding of possibility space and what might be good or bad. It blindly changes bits, and the feedback loop of natural selection says, oh, this is good or this is crap, and whatever is good survives and thrives, reproduces, and then changes and so on. So that's the most basic way of exploring possibility space. It's totally incompetent way of exploring it. It's like, the way Donald Trump, tried to govern America. I had to say that, but anyway, a cheap shot.
Hey, not a huge Trump supporter over here, so yeah, I hear you.
That's right. So how could that mechanism get better? And that's the question that's the question you ask if you want to understand how evolvability itself evolves, and how the structure of the possibility space of evolvability itself. What are good moves in terms of improving evolvability? Extraordinarily, one of the great step forwards in evolvability was sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction is a cognitive mechanism. It's a mechanism of improving evolvability. It's a mechanism for enhancing the capacity of organisms to explore possibility space. And it does it through, I won't get into the details, but it does it through recombination of genes rather than just randomly changing elements of those genes. And recombinations are more likely to be successful. They're more likely, therefore, to discover, an advantage in possibility space. So but those two mechanisms they only happen at the population level, at the competition between organisms, and they occur across the generations. So they're a very slow process. They didn't enable adaptability during the life of the organism. So that's where the great new wave in evolvability arose, was through the ability of organisms to adapt and explore possibility space during their lives. And the most known one with humans that we can easily understand was Skinnerian, operant learning, which is where you try out different behaviours. You don't have foreknowledge about whether they'll work or not. So it's as dumb as natural selection. You try out these different behaviours until one, you hit on something that works, and that in effect selects that behaviour that worked, causes it to be reproduced through time. So you've discovered an adaptation. So you're searching possibility space through, trial and error behavioural change. And Skinner, this wasn't lost on him, that this was similar to evolutionary processes. He called it selection by consequences.
Exactly.
So that was a major advance, but the fundamental limitation of that evolvability was that it died with the organism, largely speaking. So what you learned by operant conditioning during your life, died with you, unless there was, in social animals, there would have been a little bit of imitation.
A little bit of vicarious learning, but
that's right.
Not a huge amount, but some, depending.
That's right. So the great leap forward was the transmissibility of this, the results of operant learning, and the transmissibility of that, led to culture, of which imitation is a part, and so on. So that massively improved, massively accelerated the rate of exploration of possibility space evolvability. so it enabled, for example, human beings, in a few hundred years to work out how to fly through the air, while birds and so on took millions upon millions upon millions. That exploration of possibility space by genetic trial and error was even powered by sexual reproduction was far slower than anything we do. So you're right, that's the emergence of culture. The another critical development, and this will eventually loop back into everything I've been saying. Another critical development was the ability to form mental models. And here we're getting into human intelligence. So this was a major leap forward in evolvability. The formation of mental models meant that you could get a look ahead function. So look ahead as in the sense that instead of reacting to things as they exist now and trying things out as they exist now, you could actually form a mental model of how things were going to unfold.
Sure.
And you use that mental model, you use the mental model in your head to do what operant conditioning does in real life. So operant conditioning tries out behaviours in the real world, and the real world selects those that work. The mental model, you can try out possible behaviours mentally.
Yep.
And the mental model will give you feedback on what works and what doesn't. So you can plan ahead to an extent. And it's critically important to see the developmental trajectory, the levels of the development of this mental modelling capacity. So first of all, the mental modelling, it began, as all these things do, at the most simplest, and then it recursively self-improved. It built upon itself. So the first was concrete mental models. So all you could mentally model was the concrete objects in your environment. You didn't have the capacity to go abstract. So, and many human beings are still at that level. Trump hasn't quite got there yet, but many human beings are still at the concrete operations level, and you can be very, very smart at the concrete operations level. You can be an architect or of a sorts. And the classic example is that I give is Margaret Thatcher, who famously said, "There is no such thing as society.
Right.
There are just individuals and
collections of individuals or whatever."
Yeah. And she was reporting on her mental models because we can only understand the world through our mental models beyond, actually just, the images we have, the senses. And if you wander around the world, you will never see a society. So the concrete reality you perceive, I can wander around the streets of Melbourne and I can see, people buying and selling stuff and interacting and so on. But to see an economic system, to see a society and how it's organised requires going beyond the concrete. You have to build these mental structures that go beyond the concrete. And this is, of course, the problem with behaviourism as well. Behaviourism is this concrete, modelling of the world. You only can deal with things that you can touch and feel and so on. So the next step beyond concrete operations, beyond concrete modelling, is the ability to form abstract models. Abstract models are, of absolute critical importance because they powered the European Enlightenment. So the European Enlightenment was the first spread throughout humanity more generally of a capacity for abstract modelling. So abstract modelling enables you to go beyond the concrete. It enables you to understand to generalise the concrete. So moving from concrete specifics to general principles principles of logic, then applying those principles of logic is going abstract, and so on. And without it, you can't do science. So it underpinned modernism. So arguably, as I said, the European Enlightenment, its emergence was the emergence and spread of what I call analytical rational thinking.
Okay.
And that analytical rational thinking, however, was extraordinarily successful in driving science and so on. But but it's also limited. And you have to understand the limitations to see what comes next, and so on. So you talk about the first Enlightenment, you talk about the second Enlightenment, you talk about the Enlightenment Gap.
Yep.
So we're starting to get a convergence here, but there are some differences that derive from it, perhaps, but that'll come out in the discussion. But it's so because I didn't develop your term, the Enlightenment Gap, but it's a good term. It speaks to me. It speaks to my mental models of the evolution of human evolvability. So analytical rational thinking can go abstract, but basically it's the mental models that it forms and that it uses to try and understand the world.
Yep.
Are analysable models that can be thought through, models that therefore are built on linear causality, linear logic, and so on. And it's fundamentally reductionist. So these mental models are mechanistic models. Hence, they can only understand those parts of reality. They can only adequately model those parts of reality that are also mechanistic or can be approximated by mechanistic models. And Alfred North Whitehead pointed out that only about 10% of what's really important to human beings can be modelled by analytical rational thinking.
Okay.
But nearly everything that matters to us can't be. And what matters to us, whether we understand it or not, whether we're like Maggie Thatcher and can't see it because she hasn't got the mental models to see, to see it. What's critically important to us is culture, society, how you organise societies, how you create the good society, and also the evolutionary understanding. A big picture evolutionary understanding can't be arrived at through analytical rational thinking. Hence why, as a 20-year-old in Brisbane in Queensland, excelling in my Bachelor of Science degree in evolution, I looked around and said, I don't want to be here.
Right.
I want to choose life, intellectual stimulation, ideas, relevance, and none of that existed in evolutionary science at the time. So that's the limitations of analytical rational cognition. So it underpins the Enlightenment Gap. So I would interpret your characterization of the Enlightenment Gap, where you basically say, the first Enlightenment didn't deal effectively with culture and understanding culture, and didn't deal effectively with mind.
Right.
I would say that's a consequence of the limitations of the cognition that emerged and underpinned the first Enlightenment.
Okay, we're in agreement.
So then I say, well, what's next? So what can overcome the limitations? That what form of cognition? What's the next great step forward in the evolvability of human beings on this planet? So that's where this evolutionary perspective, to me, it's really interesting. It's because it's a look ahead function. It tells you what's going to happen next.
Totally.
And this is where it all becomes self-referential too. So the second Enlightenment and the cognition that underpins it is cognition that enables cognizing of complex phenomenon, basically.
Yep.
So so science, so that's the humanities domain versus, the science domain.
Yep.
It's right brain, left brain, so on. So the science, evolutionary science wasn't alone in leaving alone, human, human evolution and the nature of society and so on. It left it to the humanities. And the role of science largely has been to inhibit any attempts to develop, this complex cognition that can understand complex phenomena.
Right.
And it inhibits it by basically whenever an attempt is made. So and attempts have been made within science. So the greatest minds of the 20th century all eventually gravitate to this understanding of complexity, because it's what really matters to human beings.
Right.
And it gravitates to that, but the role of mainstream science, the negative role of mainstream science, is that whenever attempts made, it says, oh, well, that doesn't meet the requirements of science. That's
right.
This is all hand waving and so on. It's not rigorous. You can't mathematize
it's not precise. It's where's the experiments, etc.
That's right. So the role of science has been a very negative one, and extraordinarily to me, rather than that be the reaction of science, the reaction of science should have been science has and is failing as a method for understanding complex phenomena, including things that matter most to human beings, including our psychological evolution and how we organise our societies. Science should have, and that should have then given rise to, the move to say, well, what new kind of science? Science 2.0.
Yep.
Second Enlightenment science can arise that can do justice to those areas, because First Enlightenment science has failed miserably. It's instead of arrogantly saying, well, any attempts to do it have failed, it should be saying, well, our attempts, our cognition isn't effective. So what form of cognition needs to emerge? So this has been fueled by the evolutionary worldview. This has been a preoccupation of mine for some time. And in 2011, I co-organised the first planning meeting for the Second Enlightenment.
Right.
And we met on a yacht in Sausalito, which is a great place to have
That'd be a good place for that reflection.
That's right. In San Francisco Bay. And basically, who do you invite to a meeting like that? Well, there's even if I did it today, there's still hardly anyone in the world that is actually thinking of how do you intentionally identify and scaffold the new form of cognition needed to underpin the Second Enlightenment. Amen. And that, for an intentional evolutionary, for someone for an evolutionary activist, for someone who wants to do what's essential, and that is intentionally move the evolutionary process forward on Earth, because it can only happen intentionally now. And that's a key issue. That's like, that's
a holy grail dynamic here.
It is. You want to move the social evolution forward, the global system and so on, global entity. But to do that, you need, you need the higher cognition. You need the higher evolvability. You can't do that unless you can cognize complexity and have mental models that enable you to play around with complex models of social systems, for example, in your head, intervene and test out, possibilities in those social systems, all mentally, and a group of you then, doing it. And so we need the Second Enlightenment. So I organised this meeting, and it was partly stimulated by the thought that perhaps, maybe the First Enlightenment, there was some intentional work behind the scenes, in making the First Enlightenment happen. And I'm still not sure, Freemasons they're a shell of the current Freemasonry is a shell of what it was.
Right.
But it basically was a secret society to promote the rise of rationality and so on. And you need a secret society because otherwise you'll be killed. And I jokingly say that I will know that my efforts haven't been completely futile when they come and get me. When they
when they lock you away.
That's right. But at the moment, no one's coming to get me. I'm a fake. I'm a fake. So I'm safe.
Right.
Completely safe. So the first planning meeting for the Second Enlightenment, was its significance was that there was such a meeting where a group of people got together and said, how can we identify the cognition required? How can we spread it? And the people who came along were the integral people. So there was Sean Esborn Hagens, Terry Patton.
I just talked to Sean a week ago or 2 weeks ago.
Wonderful. Well, he was there. He might well not even remember it, but I ambitiously say it'll, to anyone who was there, it will end up being, in retrospect, one of the most significant events perhaps the most significant event that they participated in their life. Not because there has been no Second Enlightenment since 2011. It didn't produce, the second. It hasn't yet produced the Second Enlightenment.
There are seeds growing, but
seeds growing, and it's a symbol. It's a symbol in the sense there was an intentional step to do it, and implicit in it is the idea that you can identify the higher level of cognition and you can scaffold it. You can bring it into existence, and so on. So there will be a second planning meeting eventually, and so on.
Okay.
But as I said, there's very few people in the world working on this working on the building of an escalator. So I could call it an escalator. An escalator is a set of practices and processes and trainings that will move someone from analytical rational cognition or postmodern anti-cognition, the synthesis of the two.
Metamodern, they call it metamodern.
It's what metamodern ought to be, but so metamodernism has a number of failings. It's more postmodern than metamodern, in my view. It's basically, the main theory has been developed by two sociologists, two humanities people. It hasn't been influenced by science, and that's partly because science is analytical rational and doesn't know how to deal with this sort of stuff. But metamodernism, doesn't have an evolutionary lens. It doesn't locate things in an evolutionary framework. And importantly, it doesn't look at governance. And it doesn't look at global governance, which is, for any, way of dealing with the world and any approach to building a better world to be effective, it has to ensure the world continues. It has to ensure that this big show continues. And that means dealing with, the destructive competition, which is fueling the nuclear threat and environmental destruction. So that needs governance, and, metamodernism hasn't yet got into that. It also hasn't got an escalator. So metamodernism, the second book of Hansi Frohnacht put off considering global governance to future writing, and it hasn't got round to it yet. Secondly, Hansi says in a number of places that he's skeptical about whether you can have an escalator. Mainly because metamodernism is significantly built on the ideas of Michael Laporte Commons, the adult developmentalist. So their developmental model of human cognition is derived from Commons. Commons is like the Hansi boys are fanboys of Commons. One of them stayed with him and so on. Commons, extraordinarily, is a behaviourist. extraordinarily, he proudly says in many of these papers that his ideas don't involve any mentalism. That's how thoroughly he is. So it's all a behaviourist, actions in the world, coordinating things in the world. He doesn't postulate a mind or mental processes doing these sort of things, and hence can't possibly, or it's almost impossible to come from such a behaviourist perspective and develop an escalator, because the escalator has to install new software. It has to, call into existence new mental processes. It has to mould those mental processes and so on.
Let me. Can I pause you there for just a sec, because I'm just checking time. I think we got about 15 or 20 minutes or so in relation. There are some possible areas of. There's obviously a huge amount of overlap in our thinking. You mentioned maybe there's some areas of disagreement that we might want to explore in relation. I want to make sure we have the opportunity to do that if that's something you do want to dive into. Some of the ideas that perhaps I've shared in relation that opened up some questions in your mind in relation to how our views a lot of correspondence may diverge in certain ways. I'm open to diving into some of that, but I do want to also just say there's a brilliant summary here that, in relationship to the complexification, the hierarchical ordering of cooperation that systematizes the underlying evolvability, the overarching recognition of the underlying microcausal structure and how to generalize that. I think you've done a lot of really brilliant work in relationship to that, and it's very exciting.
I don't want to, the way I thought would be best to proceed is for me to go through my stuff and to you to interrupt me at any time. And we've got to that stage where you can interrupt me at any time and point out any disagreements or any questions you have about it, or any areas where you see that are under-justified and so on. The only overall reaction I had to your schema, your unified theory of knowledge and so on, and I've read, as I said, I've watched videos, I've read into it and so on, is this broadly what I'd say about Teilhard de Chardin, because this is a grand scheme, stimulating and so on. And what I'd say about Popper's criticism, Karl Popper's criticism of psychological grand schemes, starting with Adler, also Freud, and his differentiation between science and non-science. So, so I don't know. I asked the question. Have you looked into the Popperian approach?
Sure, of course.
So fundamentally, it's about. So he wrote a book called The Poverty of Historicism, and in an article I did for the big history journal on all this, I mentioned the big poverty of big historicism. But these are all interrelated concepts. So the poverty of historicism is that, and this is an extraordinary thing that Popper pointed to, that very few scientists, I think, really understand, because scientists use Popperian methods and so on, but they're not aware of them, or they can't evaluate them, and they don't know what their limits are or anything else. They're focused on the science, and the process. But what he pointed out was that there are an infinite number of possible theories to explain, that can fully explain all known facts. Now that's extraordinary. So it's and so you can't differentiate between those theories purely based on whether or not they can explain everything that is known, because there are an infinite number of theories that can do that. Now so that's where he came up with the idea that the only way you can differentiate between them is through their capacity to make surprising, bold, new predictions that you can then test. So it's their falsifiability that differentiates between them. So hence history, hence the failure of history and the failure so far of there being a science of history. So, historic and equally big history, as you know, inherits a similar problem, because big history is just little history, but a lot bigger. So history in general, this struck me when I was a 14-year-old suffering, history. It was compulsory to do history up until year 10 at school. And I'm sitting there and I'm, seeing what I had to learn. I had to learn the 10 reasons why the First World War occurred. And I've got to memorise those so I can reproduce them in an exam. And I'm thinking, because the easiest way to remember things is to build a structure, that unites them and reduces the information content. And I'm thinking, why those 10 reasons? Why those 10 reasons and not other possible reasons? That these are just plucked out of the air. They're not causally sufficient. They're not necessary. I didn't know the terms necessary and sufficient at the time, but it was just bunk. And the whole of history is basically that you can make up an infinite number of stories to explain any set of historical events. So where it manifests is in popular accounts of market dynamics written by economists. So you pick up a newspaper that analyses markets, and there'll be lots of explanations about why the market moved the way it did yesterday.
Of course.
And Popper would say there's an infinite number of possible stories, and that stories including, by the way you get to an infinite number is you can have invisible entities and supernatural entities involved, and with all sorts of characteristics and so on. Humanity's been fantastic at developing theories that involve supernatural entities. So what you won't find in the paper, in any paper that is analysing past economic events and explaining all of them brilliantly, you won't find explanations of what's going to happen tomorrow and the day after. Predictions, it's just rubbish. It doesn't, who can predict the market? So that's the difference between, historical sciences, historical understanding. So when I engage with, so I love big picture approaches like yourself. I'm addicted. That's where I started. But to me, their main use is to expand my mental models and serve as a challenge to develop causal micro foundations and so on, integrated into scientific knowledge. And in doing so, I learn a hell of a lot. My models develop, and I develop, more importantly, I develop the meta capacity. It develops my meta capacity to form complex models. And so on. So I've hung around the Theosophical Society a lot. So if you want to come up with unified theories of knowledge and so on, then Theosophical Society, everyone has one in their back pocket, some grand schema, and they can explain everything, and they're consistent with current knowledge. But the fundamental issue is this: what are their predictions? So what are the novel predictions they come up with that we can test in the real world? Are they falsifiable? So in my defense of my grand theorizing, I'd say, well, it's highly testable, highly falsifiable, not only because there are causal micro foundations which independently can be tested in their own domains, but because the whole shebang, the whole evolutionary story can be tested because it purports to explain and account for what's going on in the world today. So evolution is not, a million years hence, not 10 million years hence. We're evolution as it manifests in the now. And when I see us, I see this long history before it that's produced us and shaped us, and I see this long exploration of possibility space in the future in front of us, and I see what will work and what won't work, what will lead to our destruction. So so the predictions I make about, so it's a prediction here and now, it makes this century about we've got to move to a global system underpinned by global governance, the hatching of this embryo the culmination of this developmental process, the emergence of a global superorganism. And in psychology, in the evolvability domain, well, there's collective evolvability and so on, but just focusing on evolvability of human beings as opposed to evolvability of our societies and eventually the evolvability of the global superorganism. It makes specific predictions about, you know, the evolvability of individual human psychology, and predicts what, for us to survive and thrive, the next great transitions in psychological evolution need to be in human beings, and tells us how to go about achieving those, and you know, which is manifests as second enlightenment and so on. So that's just my overall reaction. So I was looking. So what I'm looking for when I'm looking at your ideas is, to what extent is it falsifiable, and most importantly of all, what does it predict about the future?
Okay. I mean, that's a particular epistemology, and certainly we can dialogue about the ways in which I would argue that it affords a fine-grained, descriptive, causal, explanatory network at whatever level you want to engage in. So right now, if you want to engage in this conversation, we can talk about ourselves as investing primates, creating influence matrix dynamics, and engage in justificatory narrative processes that are navigating certain kinds of variation, selection, retention dynamics across a stack. And then we can specify what those are with great degree of, well, first you want to specify them in relationship to clarity of the terminology.
Right. So what you've done is what is possible with all these schemas, grand schemas, is you've translated from one to another. So you can say, well, you know, when I use certain terminology and point to certain processes, they are included in your model, but there's a different language behind them and so on. So that's possible with this infinite number of, you know, possible grand schemas. As Popper says, the rubber hits the road when we look at...
I think that Popper misconstrues aspects of that in particular ways. I mean, it's a particular epistemological aspectualizing of what we learned in science in relationship to prediction models, and it's very applicable in certain regards. And I'm not saying it's not, you know, it isn't particularly useful. To use that simply as the metric, I think it's a throwaway line to say that, well, all these infinite models can do all of this various things. Actually, I say, no, find me a model that does a halfway decent job of solving the problem of psychology.
That's the question, halfway decent.
Yeah,
so now
halfway decent.
Yeah, now you're starting to you point to what criteria you know, stand for halfway decent.
Yep.
So Popper's criteria, and by the way, he evolved into an evolutionary epistemologist.
Yeah, and he gave rise to a three worldview, which is pretty weak in relationship to its ontology, metaphysics, and epistemology, certainly relative to UTOK, which kicks the shit out of that. But anyway, it affords a particular kind of big picture model that he was after as he tried to make sense at a coherentist level of the world that he was in, and he gave rise to that particular structure, which was okay, but grossly still Enlightenment Gap fucked at the level of its capacity to really make sense out of the interrelationship between the physical world, the mental world, and the cultural world in the proper evolutionary stack, situated in an information energy structure that actually has coherence. He couldn't do that. UTOK does that.
I'm not holding Popper up as, as correct on everything. It's not about authority. It's about
I'm totally. I'm simply saying that there's a particular lens, and I would argue similar to the sort of mechanism lens. There are particular lenses that we want to bring to bear: predictability, falsifiability criteria. Clearly, there's a very important epistemological criteria that Popper points to, okay, and utilizes very effectively to dismantle certain kinds of structures. I'm just saying it's not the only cudgel that I would want to bring to bear in judging a criteria for a particular theory.
Well, if I broaden Popper out to evolutionary epistemology, which, as I said, he didn't see himself as an evolutionary epistemologist, in the beginning, but I'd say he evolved into it. Hence his famous statement that, an important transition in humans was the emergence of a capacity for our ideas to die in our stead, which is my I talk about that in terms of modelling and so on.
Right.
But he was still hung up on the truth. He used truth criteria. He talked about the similitude and so on, which has come from analytic philosophy, and to me, is even pre-first Enlightenment. So it's really hampers science. But if you look at how evolutionary epistemology then moved on from that, broadly speaking, evolutionary epistemology says, and its perspective is basically that is the evolvability story I've outlined, that is that organisms in the world to survive, processes that enable them to adapt, survive, and processes that enhance their adaptability, survive. So evolvability evolves and so on. So, but fundamental to that is that there is that organisms can never discover the truth, that the truth doesn't mean anything in terms of this evolutionary perspective. What's critically important is usefulness. Does it make you more adaptable or not? Your mental model might be totally, wrong in the sense that all our mental models do not reflect reality in the sense that they're gross simplifications. So all our mental models are wrong. All the discoveries of science are basically, they're useful, characterizations that whether they, match any truth is unknowable to us. We can never know the thing in itself, and so on. So that's that's broadly the evolutionary epistemology. So usefulness becomes the criteria. So instead of hanging my hat on the falsibility criteria of Popper, I'd broaden. I can broaden it out and say, well, usefulness is the critical thing. So these grand schemas, I'd come back to and say, well, and this is more akin to your claims for what you're saying. You're saying your grand scheme is a half, at least at least a half decent. I won't.
Yeah,
I won't ask the obvious question if we were antagonistic, which is to tell me the half that it doesn't do decently. But
Sure.
all these things. So they're the criteria. Half decent means I can. Usefulness is how I would define half decent. Usefulness is the critical thing. So then it becomes a question of, where is it useful? Where could it be more useful? And so on. To me, a critically important component of usefulness is the ability to make falsifiable predictions. Okay. Because that's what, for an organism evolving in the world, a look ahead function, is this enormous evolutionary advance. At the moment, we have a deficient, we have a limited look ahead function that can only look ahead insofar as the world happens to operate mechanistically. We need a much better look ahead function. And I just want to say this to that this cognition that enables the cognizing of complexity is what's needed to understand the evolutionary worldview in the first place. So in effect, a major psychological transition that needs to occur in organisms that are needed to build a global superorganism, to hatch and develop a global superorganism, is the capacity to look ahead into complex phenomena. And certain, aspects of complexity are forever unknowable as far as I can see, but we need to be able to see attractors and how to access those attractors and how to build societies that manifest those attractors and so on. So that's where the loop's finally closed on all this, that a major transition that humanity needs to go through as a matter of urgency is the second Enlightenment, is the emergence of the complex cognition that enables us to become effective evolutionary activists to birth the global superorganism and to know how to shape it and so on. So that sort of brings me to the end of.
Yeah, no, that's great. And in fact, I mean, for me, so the tree of knowledge maps the evolution of complexification in a particular way. That's very similar to the processes of stacking the parts together to create a coordinated whole through a cooperative structure that governs the constraints of the operating processes. It says that there are also these very important network jumps through systems of information processing and communication networks. So for example, we first get it with life at the DNA, RNA, cellular structure that becomes multicellular. Then we get a different shift at the level of mind operant processes that afford you capacity to move the organism as a whole with a nervous system computational control center, if you will. Then we get language, which is another jump then and the tree of knowledge then delineates that. And it says actually the 20th century laid down this computational network of digital processing that then the 21st century is going to centralize. So it also says if we're going to network ourselves together in this hierarchical structure, the medium of that is now beginning laid down in the interface between digital and human language structures. Okay, so then you would have the actual potential information.
What are key next steps? Where do you stand on the need for a unified global system for hatching of your organism?
I certainly think that we should be oriented toward that.
So the issue is that derivable from your big picture? Is it demanded by it?
Demanded would be too strong.
Yeah. So that's what when I'm looking at your big picture, that's what I'm looking at causal microfoundations, which you have causal microfoundations within the big picture. So that takes it beyond, Teilhard de Chardin and most Theosophical Society schemas. But then the second step is predictions, falsified predictions about where we need to go in the future. So
right. Well, my pause on that, or at least where I'm coming from, it's actually our metaphysics and ontology is really screwed up. Science broke our metaphysics and ontology. And actually, if we're going to map it, we actually have to push a pause a little bit to get our descriptive metaphysics and ontology correct. If we get our descriptive metaphysics and ontology correct, we'll be in a much better place to describe these issues without equivocation, and then we'll be able to think better about them. My general sense is you're right in relationship to the direction that we need to go. The calling for it is felt in my soul. At the same time, the specification that is afforded by it, there's a lot more reflection that I would need to be engaged in relationship to say demanded. But those are, I'm definitely with you in terms of my whole sort of like, hey, we're at a fifth joint point. We need a second enlightenment. The world's at a very, very key element. And to the extent that we get a higher order metasynthetic view of our essence and then utilize that to coordinate our interests at a global level, fuck yeah, I'm all for that.
So yeah, the evolutionary worldview that I've outlined does demand certain things. It demands them in the sense that they're needed if we are to survive and thrive into the future. Because the big picture evolution is identifying what's needed to survive and thrive. So it demands these things. There is a role. As I said, the extraordinary thing about this whole process is that for it to be completed successfully, that is to produce a complex, evolvable, agentic superorganism, for that process to be completed demands that humanity wake up to the evolutionary worldview and see what's needed. Won't happen otherwise. The process will be aborted on this planet. We will be stillborn. We will not enter the next level in the stack, because the next level of the stack at a higher level, if there is a higher level of other global superorganisms, then the most significant thing for them and their evolvability is contact with and learning from independently evolved systems that have different perspectives and so on. So if you want to have a brain at the level of the galaxy.
Now there's a prediction you can, if we reach a global intelligence and then plug into the network of universal global intelligences, then I'll be like, damn, John, you were onto that thing.
That's right. So that's my bold.
And that is a bold prediction. I'll popper you and say, I'll bow down to that if that prediction comes true in our lifetime.
Well, in your lifetime, depends how long you live. But
well, if it's outside my lifetime, it's going to be hard for me to say you confirmed it.
That's right. So just to bowl up another challenge here, and I understand how you've characterised the benefit of your system, but what I would like, what I'm would be particularly interested in is, given the domains that you've looked at, is you see the need for a second enlightenment. The question is, what will constitute the second enlightenment? What will be the form of cognition that underpins it? And how can this be scaffolded? So getting very, very practical, very, very practical. So it's like being at the first enlightenment before anyone else is, and saying, analytical rational cognition is the way to go.
Yep.
There's all this potential for us to manipulate reality and achieve our goals and so on, this look ahead function. So no longer will we be evolving by looking in the rear view mirror, which is what selection is, looking at past consequences. We'll be looking at the future. So someone sitting down at the first enlightenment and saying, okay, what are the nuts and bolts of this form of cognition? What software do we need to install in others? How will we do it? That's the position we are for the second enlightenment now.
Yep.
So we've only probably got a minute left. So if you can tell me how to do it, I can retire. You can take over.
I think the architecture of that structure, that meta perspective that affords an orientation of knowledge and wisdom into the future, that creates a particular kind of higher order synthesis that affords us constraints and evolvability, giving us both freedom and cooperation, is a very, very nice set of ingredients in relation. Okay. All I'm saying is, if we actually, take the tapestry of individuals that are seeing this, have an outline for where we can place it to afford a diminishing of our equivocation around key terms, get clearer about relationship to that. That is a tapestry that I bring to bear, a clear descriptive metaphysical grounding that specifies the ontology of things like the mental relative to behavioral. Like, what the fuck do we mean by those terms? I actually now know what we mean by those terms, or what we ought to mean with coherence. If we can achieve that, that's one particular facet. I believe lots of us are bringing particular facets. And then the question is, can we actually coordinate our synthetic views to weave together a tapestry that forms a ground that can then be evolvable toward the future? Hey, we do that, then we will be on the cusp of a second enlightenment.
Okay, so I get clearly now how you characterize your grand scheme. And it's basically creating the foundations from which, the key issue of the second enlightenment, for example, can be effectively answered, because it can't, now. And so you're creating the foundations for that, which is wonderful work. Good luck with it.
All right. And then we'll get the future arc, and then we'll see how this thing turns out in a proper fashion.
That's right.
All right.
And I will watch with extraordinary interest as you progress. So,
and I look forward to circling back. This is a wonderful conversation. I think you've laid out the manifesto that you did, the arrow that we need to attend to, the two key principles of higher order cooperation and evolvability as the fundamental microcausal structure, and the implications of that we should be leaning towards. Beautiful stuff, John. Really appreciate it.
Wonderful. And it's been wonderful talking to you.
Enjoyed it. We'll be back in touch. And thanks so much for your coming on and sharing your wisdom with us.
Great.
All right. Take care.